Welcome to Security Analysis. I am Uday Bhaskar. The subject for this week is in many ways self-chosen, if I could put it that way. Over the last 48 hours, literally, we've had some very unexpected but radical developments as related to the maritime domain, which is that in a surprise announcement, the United States President, Mr. Joe Biden, on September 15, in a joint press event, he announced that the US and the United Kingdom would support Australia in acquiring nuclear-propelled submarines, what is referred to as the SSN. And the umbrella for this is a very interesting acronym. It's called Aukus, as in AUKUS, Alpha Uniform Kilo Uniform Sierra in naval terms, which is Australia, UK, and US. The gist is that over the next couple of years, perhaps, the US and the United Kingdom would help Australia to acquire 6 SSNs, and they would also be a wider spectrum of military cooperation specific to the maritime domain, as also in cyber and all the new technologies. So what we are going to discuss is what is the AUKUS all about, and what will it do to the Quad, for instance, since there is a summit meeting coming up on the 24th of September, for which Prime Minister Narendra Modi would also be attending with his other counterparts from the US, Japan, and Australia. And what will it do to the interlocutor who has not been named at any of the Quad's deliberations? Remember, the Quad is a security dialogue. And much of it, of course, has been triggered by the rise of China. But yet, there is no reference to China. So all of this and more. To place this in context and to walk us through, I have great pleasure in welcoming and introducing Admiral Arun Prakash. Welcome to the show, sir. As most of you are aware, Admiral Arun Prakash is a former Chief of Naval Staff. He's been chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. He is what in service lore he is referred to as a sailor pilot scholar, fighter pilot, Gallantry Award in 1971. And he has been post-retirement a voice that is heard with great respect for the many insights that he brings to bear, not just on military security, I would say about many of the values and principles that are so dear to any democracy. Arun sir, I thought that I would request you in the first instance to just talk about AUKUS. It's an odd acronym, AUKUS, but you have in the past written about the Indo-Pacific and the salience of this region. What does the AUKUS do to the Indo-Pacific in the first instance? Arun sir, all yours.
Thank you, Uday, for having me on your show and for all the kind things that you just said. I think AUKUS is very aptly named. It's an awkward emergence. But I think life seems to have come a full circle in the last 50 years. Because if you throw your mind back in the mid-60s, the UK found it rather difficult to sustain itself east of Suez, and they started withdrawing from this part of the world, giving up their bases and so on, Singapore and so on. And they went home eventually. At the same time, India was also agitating for what we call the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace and Tranquility. And after a lot of struggle, I think the UN also declared in 1971 the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace. And that essentially meant keeping the superpowers and their nuclear submarines out of this area. So here we are in 2021, where this AUKUS seems to be bringing everything back now. So here we have an alliance of 3 powers, their focus in the Indo-Pacific. There are a number of surprises here. One is that these 3 nations are already allied with each other. UK and USA are members of NATO. Then USA, New Zealand, and Australia are part of ANZUS. They're also part of an intelligence overarching intelligence alliance called the Five Eyes. So this is something I think which has taken a lot of people by surprise. Certainly, I have been taken by surprise. And then this business of transferring nuclear technology to Australia for creating a small fleet of nuclear attack boats. Again, it's a surprise development which we can talk about. So all said and done, and also the timing is strange because we had in March we had a virtual Quad summit of all the Quad heads of state. In the next week or so, we're going to have an actual face-to-face Quad meeting. So with all this excitement about Quad and also about exercise Malabar, which was just given over last week in the Philippine Sea with four countries taking part, and they're also members of the Quad. So with all this going on in the middle of it, you sort of throw this little googly of a new alliance. I think it will take people like you, especially security analysts, by surprise.
I think there's a subtext here, sir, if I may put it that way, which is that if you remember when we had the virtual summit in early March, this was the first major international meeting that President Joe Biden had convened after assuming office. And in a very distinctive departure, soon after the summit, literally a day after, the Washington Post carried an op-ed which was signed by these four leaders, Mr. Biden, Mr. Modi, Mr. Suga, and Mr. Morrison. And there you could see that all four of them collectively, what they could not say, there was no joint statement, if you remember. They had individual statements, but in their joint article, the op-ed, they spoke about the commitment to the free and open Indo-Pacific and international law. And that's when I thought President Biden indicated that they are going to move in a very resolute manner. And clearly, as you say, you were caught by surprise. And I think the whole, I would say, international community, especially the principal stakeholders, for instance, France, which is a NATO ally, which is also supplying or had a contract with Australia. They are very angry, to put it mildly. And my sense is that even the other Quad partners, perhaps even Japan and India, were not in the loop about this decision because it must have been done very, very quietly. But the real, I would say, surprise is for China. So what is your assessment? Because if you remember, in the past, China had dismissed the Quad as foam that would soon dissipate. But yet, every time there is a reference to the Quad, they get very hot under the collar. So what is your reading about what the Aukus will do to China, first of all, militarily, and later, what does it do to the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific? Arun, sir?
Well, as you say, the Quad has actually been going around the dragon in the room. On most occasions when they've met and issued statements and so on, they've deliberately avoided either naming China or confronting it head on. So the whole idea of, to a layman like me, the whole idea of creating this forum is wasted, because if you shy away from actually naming China or even hinting at its aggressive conduct, then China naturally doesn't take it seriously, and they very appropriately scoffed at it and said it will blow away with the wind as a bit of foam. So I think other than the USA, the three other members have been actually quite diffident about China, which is actually the raison d'etre of the Quad and the Malabar and so on. All this show of togetherness is China, which is acting very aggressively in the South China Sea. As you know, they've got away with virtually everything that they wanted to do in the South China Sea, whether it is staking claims, making maps, reclaiming, creating artificial islands, fortifying them, defying the United Nations Court of Justification, etc. So they've got away with everything. On this side of Malacca Strait, they have actually bared down on India. They're all along our northern frontiers. They've advanced, they've grabbed territory which they wanted to. They are making further threats for the state of Arunachal Pradesh. So China is actually getting away with whatever it wants to do. Quad has so far been ineffective. What is the reason? I'm not too sure, because apart from USA, the other three members have shown distinct diffidence and ambiguity as far as confronting China is concerned. So perhaps it is President's Biden's thought process that if we step away from Quad and create an alternate alliance, maybe that'll be more effective. But here again, I would say that picking on the UK, which is, I would say, without causing any offense to the Brits, is that post-Brexit, it's a diminished power. It's clout, reaching out to the Indo-Pacific, although it sent an aircraft carrier task force, and various politicians and even naval reps have been talking about global Britain. But how global can Britain get at this stage of its life? So picking on US, UK rather than picking on one of the local partners like India or US or Japan is again raises a question: what is the logic behind it? And I would say that personally speaking, I think it's a bit of a disappointment that India has been left out. But we can come back to that later on.
So on this, there are two issues that you have touched upon, which I want to extend as part of the discussion. The first is you spoke about diffidence, in relation to the other three countries in the Quad, which is Japan, India, and Australia. And I just want to remind our viewers also that each of these countries has a very complex relationship with China. And we know that Australia has had a rather turbulent ride, because we know that over the last year plus, ever since Australia had taken a position on COVID, Beijing has literally, I think, taken them to task and has put them under severe economic and trade sanctions. And there is a lot of, I would say, domestic agitation within Australia about how they should deal with China. Japan has a historical legacy issue with China, but they also have this very robust trade relationship. And I think that's part of globalization, that none of them can really sever their relationship with China. And I think much the same applies for India. So I think this diffidence has a certain, I would say, context again. But from the American perspective, I thought that the way in which the Quad has moved has actually been very prudent, that they called it a security dialogue. And as far as naval capabilities go, I think it's often been said that navies are nurtured and you create naval capability at sea, not country-specific way, in the sense that it is to have a broad bandwidth. And in that sense, I think, there have been a few, I would say, sort of moving forward, backward. But today, the Quad is slowly gaining a certain degree of coherence. And I read these statements very carefully of the three leaders in the press conference. And again, I'm going back to what President Biden had said, that along with this trilateral Aukus, the United States would also be looking at Quad and ASEAN and other partnerships to be able to ensure that the freedom of navigation and all the other principles that have been upheld, I think, by the entire global community, except China, as you pointed out, would be advanced. So to that extent, I think there seems to be a method in the madness. And clearly, if you look at where technology is going, all these are mentioned in these statements of the Quad leaders, that apart from maritime, they are going to be looking at cyber. They would be looking at space. And my sense is that along with artificial intelligence, underwater domain awareness would also become a major issue. And all of this, I think, would punctuate the Indo-Pacific in a way that would perhaps be favorable to the US-led like-minded countries, and in a way inhibit China, particularly because of its own geography and the fact that it can't break out, from its own Pacific coast. Would that be a fair kind of assessment, Arun sir?
Yes, I tend to agree with much of what you said, Uday, but India's case is a little different from the other Quad members. I mean, Australia is thousands of miles away from China. Japan, of course, is at its doorstep, and they have strong trade relationships. But in India's case, we are cheek to jowl with China. We share a long border. China has also created an axis with Pakistan. So we have now two countries, both nuclear armed, on our borders. Then China takes a blatant claim on a huge chunk of Indian territory. So that creates a situation. I mean, freedom of navigation and so on are lofty ideals, etc. And we subscribe to them, but they are not as immediate as the huge PLA sitting at your doorstep and knocking at your door and claiming your territory. So that's a huge threat. So our threat is far more urgent and immediate than that of the other countries involved in it. And also the asymmetry between China and India in most spheres. Economy-wise, they are 3 or 4 times bigger than us. Military-wise, they are far bigger. Technology, which is the key to everything today. China is now neck to neck with America, whereas we are far behind. So there is a huge asymmetry. So given the nature of threat, the huge asymmetry between India and China, our case is a little different. So we need a India needs a breathing spell of 5, 10, 15 years, whatever our statesmen or diplomats can create for us. And in that 10, 15 years of breathing spell, we should try and catch up on the economy, which is the key to the whole thing. And once our economy picks up, then the military can catch up and technology will follow. So we need a breathing. So given this asymmetry, given the overbearing attitude of China, they're not willing to step back. I mean, we've been talking of status quo and keeping resumed for the last 18 months. Nothing has happened. So given all this, and given our relatively inferior situation, we need somebody to bolster us. And we need some concrete steps, an alliance, partnership, whatever you call it, to help China to back off a little bit. So that's the point I'm making, that our situation is not the same as that of the other 3 Quad members. We need to make a concrete, send a concrete message to China, which will make China pause in whatever it plans to do. So to that extent, we have to take a different.
No, that's true. I mean, I would say that perhaps we are the only country, whether we talk about the Quad or we talk about Aukus, ASEAN, which has gone through a Galwan experience, meaning that we are the only country that has this territorial dispute. And it is something that none of the other countries that engage with China are facing. So my sense again is that if you look at what are the options before India, that the partnership with the United States is clearly been one of the options that India has exercised. And again, there is a context, when we go back to the civilian nuclear agreement and the fact that the United States did all the heavy lifting to ensure that India was accorded the exceptional status that it did. So which is what brings me to the other point. Yesterday, I heard the Chinese Foreign Office speaking about AUKUS. And one of the points that the spokesman made was to suggest that the United States was in transgression of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, by giving this kind of assistance to Australia, which is a signatory to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. And I thought that there was a real case of chutzpah here, because you will recall that China had provided very deep assistance as far as weapons of mass destruction are concerned over the last 3 decades, both to Pakistan and to North Korea. So when China has already done this, and they have, I've often said, enabled even terrorism by providing nuclear weapons to Pakistan, therefore China is culpable. For them to make this particular point in public, I thought is not tenable. And there is, I would say a whole dimension here that needs to be addressed, because it is possible that other countries might also go for nuclear propulsion. I mean, why not a South Korea? They have just carried out a submarine launched ballistic missile test from a conventional boat. So how do you see all of this?
Well, you made a good point about China, but of course, China is immoral or amoral in its international relations and geopolitics and so on. So they will do this kind of thing. But speaking purely from India's self-interest point of view, I think this, to me, it looks like a missed opportunity for us. The fact that USA has offered nuclear propulsion technology to Australia. Okay, that's fine. People are now talking about the Anglo-Saxon sort of inclination. I mean, that's a bit racist, but let's call it the Anglosphere, the English-speaking countries which tend to stick together. Fine. So they're offering it to Australia, which
I think we better stick to the formulation of English-speaking, because the French are incensed. They have said that we stabbed in the back.
Yeah. So this is a core. This is the heart of the Anglosphere. These 3 countries. So Australia, as you know, they've been sort of quite nasty at times as far as we are concerned. When we did our nuclear tests, etc. They walked out, and they refused to sell us uranium and so on. Leaving that aside, in the Indo-US context, now it's been a long time since India and USA have been getting closer and closer. And I think one of the milestones in this relationship was the Indo-US nuclear deal, which gave India the de facto status of a nuclear weapon state without having signed the NPT. Now that was a huge, huge step forward. So that had raised a lot of hopes in India that things would move. And I've got this listed out on a piece of paper. In 2004, we were given the status of, we talked about the next steps in strategic partnership in the US. Next, the following year, we signed a defense framework agreement. In 2012, there was the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, DTTI. This was followed by a major defense partner status being accorded to India by US Congress. Then we signed those 4 foundational agreements, which in the armed forces were given to understand that until we sign those 4 agreements, we can't really get close militarily to America. And so we've done that now. So to my mind, all obstacles in the path of Indo-US relationship have been removed. And from time to time, American politicians have come to Delhi and said, offer to make India a great power, and that kind of talk, which is very heartening for us to hear. But in actual fact, what India has long sought for, or should have sought, is advanced technology, the kind of technology which USA gave to China either willingly or China took it surreptitiously over a period of 30 years, which has placed China where it is today, almost neck to neck with USA and ahead of it in certain fields like AI and so on. So either America has failed to offer all this to us, or we've failed to ask for it strongly enough. And nuclear propulsion, something that we wanted. Personally, when I was in service, we've asked for it, not for submarines, but maybe for a surface ship, for an aircraft carrier. We are getting nuclear propulsion technology from Russia, but America is far ahead. They're into the 17th, 18th version of a nuclear. So we were told at that time that the US, in very strong words and very sternly, that the US Congress will never contemplate transferring nuclear propulsion technology to any other country. And here we have now, it's being offered to Australia. So I think this is something for us to reflect on, that we failed to leverage this so-called low-hanging fruit of Indo-US relationship and not acquire. We paid good hard cash for $22 billion worth of hardware, but that doesn't put us any further down the road to self-sufficiency. That's a point I'd like to make.
So, but I just want to add to this. I mean, you know all this. I'm saying this more for the benefit of our viewers, and many of them are Gen Next, which is that you made reference to Russia, the former Soviet Union, which has actually enabled and assisted India in the whole nuclear propulsion domain. And even when the Cold War was still in the last phase, India was able to get the first nuclear submarine on lease, the INS Chakra, from the former Soviet Union. I recall that very distinctly. Admiral Nadkarni was our chief of naval staff at that time. And then Captain Ravi Ganesh had brought the first Chakra to India. From the US perspective, I think, as I see it, one of the constraints in the US Congress, and one has had occasion to speak to them off and on over the last decade plus, they are unable to, I think, reconcile that India has this particular partnership with Moscow, and that Moscow has actually provided India not just the nuclear propelled submarine, but various other military inventory items. And how can they provide higher levels of technology when they have their own, I would say, anxieties? Now, there is a great irony here, because as you rightly said, China has been surreptitiously acquiring many advanced technologies that the United States had tried to guard, but yet they have lived with this anomaly. So now that they have done Australia, and I'm sure that they will work on their Congress for the special, exception or exemption, they had done the same thing for India in the period 2005 to 8, when we were given the special status. So with all this as the context, and going back to that old adage, that when the strategic environment or the conditions change, major powers are inclined or compelled to go down certain paths that they would not have otherwise. So Against that backdrop, if China's rise is going to proceed the way all indicators seem to suggest, do you foresee that nuclear propulsion and the new technologies, whether it is cyber, space, AI, spectrum dominance, could be an area not only for India-US bilateral cooperation, but something that could come under the banner or the umbrella of both AUKUS and the Quad? What do you think about that?
Well, one of the points that that need to be made is that we've been good friends with the USSR, Soviet Union, and we continue to have good relations with Russia. But the relationship has become a little brittle, and it's become quite transactional. The Russians need they take hard cash, they need our cash, and we need their weapons. But the relationship to be so heavily reliant on one source of weaponry, 60 to 70% of all our military hardware comes from Russia. That's an unhealthy state to be in. We need to, first of all, we need to be Atmanirbhar. We need to be making everything in India. But till we reach that stage, we need to diversify. So if India is to wean itself away from Russian sources of military hardware, then the logical other source is the USA, which has the best and the most advanced technology. So if the US Congress has hesitation about sharing technology with a country which is buying Russian hardware, say the S-400, we are buying it because we have no choice. Who else will give us an advanced weapon system like that? So I think that logic needs to be introduced to the US Congress, that if you need to wean India away from, we can't be rendered weaponless. So if we have to be weaned away from Russia, then you have to offer us something, and then you have to place trust in your partners. After all, China, Australia and China have been pretty close to each other in the very recent past. So if you're going to trust Australia, then you can jolly well trust India too. So I think in the years to come, and nuclear technology is the way ahead. We need to get away from fossil fuels and so on. And once you put a nuclear reactor on anything, on a submarine, on an aircraft carrier, or even on a surface warship, it gets unlimited endurance. It's the fallout is tremendous. That's a key area that we need access to, and we are struggling with at the moment.
So in this, entire sort of, the kind of options that you speak about as far as India is concerned, we can see the limitations. India has had this very close relationship with Moscow for 5 decades plus. And we are talking about India at 75 in terms of the 2022 anniversary of Indian independence. But yet our ability to absorb really significant critical technologies in the military domain, both for design and manufacturing, has been limited. So there are reasons why with Moscow, we have still remained at the level of assembling, whether it's aircraft or tanks, and we haven't got much design assistance from them, barring the nuclear kind of, I would say, basket. With the US, you have identified, the reasons why we haven't made much progress. What about France? We have had a fairly close relationship with France. I mean, you remember as a naval pilot, the Alizé, they often say, was the first aircraft to actually land on the carrier. I could be wrong on this, but it's an old relationship. Now with this recent experience where France is actually talking about you can never trust Britain. I mean, I've been seeing social media. They are actually reviving memories of 500 years, that why the French can never trust the Brits and, stab in the back, etc., all of that. But for India, in a pragmatic way, are there niches that we could consider having the equivalent of a smaller cluster of cooperation? Not that we speak French, but that India and France might be able to do a few things, given that France is a resident Indian Ocean power. Arun sir?
Yes, we've had a good relationship with France. And if you go back in history, it's an obscure reference, but in the 19th century, there were two admirals, Admiral Suffren, the French admiral, and Admiral Hughes, the Brit. They had a long-running battle off the east coast of India. And had the French admiral won, then possibly you and I would have been speaking French. But they've been very reliable partners as far as military hardware is concerned. And right from the beginning, starting from the 1950s, early 1951, we got the Uragan, the Tufani, the Mirage, and so on, Mystère, and so on. So they've been very reliable. Their equipment is very good. They charge a top buck for it.
An
but
arm and a leg and more.
yes, that's all right, but it's worth it. And don't forget that when we carried out our nuclear tests in 1999, they were fully supported us. They were one of the few powerful countries which did supported us. So I think we should certainly approach the French and their technology. They have a lot of advanced technologies. They'll give it to you, sell it to you for a price. But it's worth taking up, as you said, like we've taken up with Israel. They've got certain key technology strengths, and we are making full use of it, paying for it. Similarly, France has its strengths, and we should seek other sources of military hardware.
No, this is purely kite flying at this stage, but I imagine, and this is purely conjecture on my part, I have no smoking gun. But after Aukus gained some traction, my sense is that India and Japan could also be looking at certain niches in the advanced technologies. And here I'm looking at Taiwan as a, I don't know whether one can use the word nation, country, but definitely Taiwan, given the kind of profile it has certain strengths when it comes to advanced technology, particularly as far as computer chips and other, I would say, areas are concerned. So maybe, just maybe, that there are some kind of possibilities. But as a final question to you, sir, given your perch and your deep experience and the way that you have had this 360-degree view of this entire Indo-Pacific and what it means for India at the level of higher defense management, is there any takeaway that you want to identify? What should India be really sort of prioritizing, given all our constraints, COVID, a GDP that is at this point impacted, we do not have enough resources. All we have is HR, which is young India. What do you see as, long-term policy options for India post whatever has happened in the last few days, weeks?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, Uday, I think we definitely need a spell of 10 to 15 years to catch our breath, so to speak. And during these 10 to 15 years, we must follow sensible, pragmatic economic policies, which will put our economy on the curve that we were following pre-COVID, growth rate of 7, 8, 9, or even two digit. And once that happens, then many other things will fall into place when we will regain our position vis-a-vis other countries. The second thing we need to remember is that there is no sentimentality or soft corners in international relations. Every country has to look out for itself. And I think we've just seen a demonstration of that. Realpolitik. President Biden has thought up something and created this new alliance. Now we need to look around, keep our options open. As you pointed out, France is an Indian Ocean country. They are more than willing to cooperate with us. Japan. I read a recent news item that Japan has now agreed officially to share military technology with Vietnam. So if they're going to share with Vietnam, then why not India? And they've got advanced technology in many spheres. So we need to be proactive, reach out, ask for things. I mean, we've been for far too long, not active enough. We've assembled and thousands of fighters and engines and so on, but we've not learned how to make one. And that is because we lack a vision. The vision of every statesman is extended to 5 years, next election. We need a statesman to think of 50 years, 100 years of vision for self-reliance in military hardware. So I think economy, military, self-sufficiency, those are the two key areas that we need to work on and create visions and lay them down. And regardless of elections and which party comes into power, those long-term visions should be followed like they have in the case of space and atomic energy and power and so on. I think that's my last word.
Sir, thank you. I'm sure that when the Quad Summit on September 24th issues its document, we may have a few pointers about the way ahead. My own gut is that this Aukus would complement the Quad as also the ASEAN, but I'm sure that we would have an opportunity to invite you again to share your thoughts on this very complex subject. But on that note, let me thank Admiral Arun Prakash. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Uday.
And as far as AUKUS, the Quad, the ASEAN are concerned, all of them are now subsumed under the Indo-Pacific, which has been stirred very vigorously, if I may put it that way. And we have to see how China is going to respond to all these developments. Thank you for watching Security Analysis. We'll be back again with another subject next week. Jai Hind.